Hey guys, and welcome to View and a Brew. Welcome to View and a Brew with Gaz.
Today I'll be working on a Flames of War miniature. These come in 15mm. This is the German 251 transport. It's got lovely detail worked into it. I've kept the tops separate to make easy access and to be able to paint a bit easier. Inside we see it's got two forward positions, of which there's a driver and co-driver position, and a number of slatted seats at the back. This was for carrying troops. The driver comes as a half model, which is kind of handy because that's all you'll really see. The front of him will be totally out of sight, but we'll get to see the back of him once he's in the seated position. The second miniature he comes with is a gunner. He goes on the gun shield at the front, carrying an MG42, same as the one mounted at the back. Really nice. To get us started, I've got CITADEL colour contrast golem and flesh, and we're going to go to the skin with this. I've stayed straight away on the small brush. These are obviously quite small models. I chose to mount these parts onto a pencil with a bit of blue tack. Gives me easy access to most of the model, and as this one's stuck by the bottom, this is the only area I really need to paint. With the face done, I moved on to the hands. These have some nice deep areas, allowing for the ink to hold into those parts. We quickly move on to the gunner himself. This is obviously a full model, but essentially we're just going to do the same thing again. I carefully move around the contrast medium, just so that it sits in all the dark recesses. With the hands finished, I moved on to the face. Again, we're only looking for a single sort of layer, keeping the ink thin, all the contrast if that's what you're using, and working it into the recesses to give it some colour and shape. You can see it works really well. With the skin complete, I moved on to CITADEL layer VULKAN green. It's not quite the right colour for the helmets, but we'll work on that with a bit of ink after. Having thinned it down, I applied it liberally over the surface. Both these minis will be flicking through during this video, as we transition from one colour to another on each part. For the next phase, it's CITADEL colour contrast BASILICANUM grey. I wonder if you can guess where we're going to go with this. That's right, we're going to do the uniform. This is a little lighter than the initial layer of the uniform, but it's a good start point, and we can always do more than one layer to darken it down, as you can see here. It's really picked up all those dark spots, all the shadowed areas really nicely. If nothing else, it gives you a really good standpoint to use shadow and light. For many, this will actually be about as much as you need to do. The gunner has much more detail, covering a larger surface area, so I switched to a larger brush. We gradually move it around the model from one end to the other. I do prefer to start at one end, that way I generally don't miss any areas. I'm always cautious with that because I hate it later on when I come back to an area I missed. With the trousers finished, the upper torsos are straightforward. I am being kinda wary though of the places we've already painted, and the fact that some areas, such as the belt and the webbing straps, are actually going to be a different colour. So I'm trying to stay away from them. Well, trying. For that belt that we just talked about, I'm going to be using CITADEL colour contrast black TEMPLAR. This is one of my go-tos, and I do really like this colour. Obviously we've gone back to the small brush for this one. We've got some really thin areas to try and get this down on. The plan is just to do one sort of wash. I may use one of the greys that we use on the uniform to highlight it up a bit. It's actually interesting to see at this point the difference in the two colours. This one really has a darker pigment that's so obvious that you would never get the two mixed up once they're on the miniature. With the belt and webbing done, I then apply this same colour to the gun. I really like this as a start point for working on any of the guns when I'm looking to do a basic non-metallic metal. I did notice at this point there's some rounds hanging out the left side, so I'll break it down into two halves, doing first the barrel assembly and then the body of it a bit later. This is going back to working around the model. Having achieved a certain level and letting it dry, I now transition to the belt, before going back to the gun itself. With the gun complete, I noticed the boots were in dire need of some darkening. So we chucked some of the black onto them as well. Why not? We'll probably bring these up a bit with some grey. It's amazing how quick you can turn around and get a tabletop standard miniature with these contrast paints. For our next colour, I'll be using CITADEL Shade Drakenhof Nightshade. This was just to do a couple of dark spots onto the goggle assembly of the driver. It's crazy really, you're not going to see it once he's in position, but at least I know I've done it. Citadel layer Eshin Grey was going to be the next step. Obviously we need to bring up the grey a little bit. This is a good start point. It's actually a darker grey than the BASILICANUM finishes, but that's okay, because it gives us a really nice visual reference from the BASILICANUM grey to apply this liberally in the areas that are the high points. I make sure to stay away from the really dark areas that the BASILICANUM grey has given us, because that helps a lot with establishing what should be light and what should be shadow on these minis. I have thinned down this colour with some water, and I'm trying not to go fully to the roots in areas. Again, we're staying away from the dark points, but just trying to bring up those higher points. This is generally a method I use a lot now. I start with contrast to establish what it should look like, sometimes leaving it alone if it's fine, and if not, I go back in with layers. Once finished, you can see how much it's darkened down some places, but the colour was way too light to be the uniform of the Germans. Citadel layer Dawnstone is our next stage. Rather than go straight to this, I mix some of this in with the grey we already have on the palette from the Eshin Grey. Just a small amount to bring it up a little to see if it's the right tone or not. With this, I concentrate a little more on the high areas, leaving some of the darker recesses completely alone. So maybe painting 2/3 to 3/4 of those areas, rather than paneling right up to those black lines we established with the first contrast. I imagine you can see where we're going with this now. It's just going to be a couple of layers, lighter and lighter greys, painting less and less. By keeping it really thin, even if you cross over some of the dark points, they generally come through once it's dry. Next up is Citadel Shade NULN Oil. Probably again my favourite shade coat. So simple and you can get so much out of it. I did say that helmet was a little too bright. It's not quite the right tone and the right colour. The early German helmets were often almost black in colour, even though they started out as a green. So I'm using this to tone it down a bit. I understand there's plenty of ranges out there that have the exact colour, but if you haven't got it yourself, you make do with what you have. This is my process for getting that colour down to a much darker green that almost looked black. Now we're back to Citadel layer Dawnstone. So previously we mixed it in with the Eshin Grey. Now this is the pure colour of Dawnstone. So I've gone to one of my much smaller brushes, and as you can see I'm using the edge of it and the tip just to highlight certain areas and bring the colour tone up a bit. I'll do a bit more when it comes to the arm sections. This again heavily thinned, as you can see on the top of the shoulder. It will allow me to manipulate it easily and allows a level of opaqueness, so it will dry a little different in colour, maybe a bit darker. I use my finger here to show you just how small this guy actually is. With much more surface area, the German gunner is going to show off much easily how bright these tones are. The good thing about this is there's a real level of controllability. If you find at the end of it that you've made it way too bright, or even a little bit, you can go back and thin down some NULN oil and run it over the whole grey section. So never be too worried about bringing it up too much, because if you do, there's always a way back. It's just about getting the thickness of your colours right, I think. The other thing to think about is these are going to dry not quite the same shade as they initially go on. If you look at those areas above that have already been painted, they're already starting to darken down in tone to what we first applied. It's crazy really, but don't make any snap judgments when you initially put it on. Wait until it dries and then make your judgment. With a little bit of the Dawnstone, I touch up the back of the belt. This is a good point as well to use the Dawnstone for one of the initial highlights on the gun. We're just wanting to add a level of 3D to it. So although this looks bright at this point, again, once dry, it will actually tone down considerably. As you can see now in this final image. Again, the grey's not quite there yet. It's almost a bluey grey. I love these small minis. It's a crazy amount of detail. Next up is Citadel Layer White Scar. Rather than jump all the way to a ridiculous highlight, I add a little bit of this, and I do mean a little, into the Dawnstone to do a final highlight. Or so I hope. This is pretty much a process that we've carried all the way through this section when painting the German uniform. Just gradually coming up in tones, painting smaller and smaller areas, spreading out more and more, adding more and more water, increasing opaqueness, to just try and get the finish we want. It might seem a little crazy on models that are so small. It is very crazy on the driver, due to the fact you won't see him mainly because of the position he'll be sat in. There's no front slit in the 251. Well, there is, but there's no hole there for you to see the driver through. The gunner, however, we will see a bit more of. He's quite prominent once he's in the miniature. With the colour scheme I have planned, his grey will definitely stand out against the green, cream, and the sort of reddy brown that I'll be using as the mid-1940s war, so around the 43 era, colour scheme. That'll be in part 2 though, which will be released either next week or in 2 weeks' time at my normal schedule. We've yet to decide yet, but hopefully you'll enjoy both parts. I figured I'd put the crew in as well, simply because, well, we're going to be painting them. Why not? It's good content, and it's a couple of models that you might not think to do very often. Especially stuff like drivers and gunners. You'll often have your infantrymen running around with rifles and such, but these are a little different. Back up to the gun assembly, I again bring it up a little bit more. As I always say, don't worry about that initial colour tone. It's not going to finish like that once dry. You can already see at the tip of the barrel how the initial 3 strokes have started to darken down. While looking at the gun in this area, I'm also looking at the skin. I've tried to decide whether to do a highlight of that as well. I was about to say layer up, but it's actually going to be another highlight. In the end, due to the scale, I decided not to. I think it was good enough. I'm really looking for the smaller areas of the gun assembly now to do final highlights, as I believe this is about as high as I want to bring it. If I brought it to white, it would look a little too sci-fi, so I'm just paneling out sections and finishing it off. For the rounds on the side of the gun though, we'll go to Citadel Layer Auric Armor Gold. I think that's how you say it. This has got a really strong count of metal flake, but it doesn't apply that easily because it seems to have a lot of medium in it. So I do a number of layers over time to make sure that I've got a nice clean gold colour across all the parts, and I try and let it dry almost completely, if not completely, between each layer. It's a bit of a process. Citadel Shade Reikland Flesh Shade is the next one I'll be applying. Again, we're going straight back to the same area. There is some really nice detail between each of the rounds, and I needed something to pick this up, which is why I grabbed the Reikland Flesh Shade. Obviously we use it on skin sometimes, and it works quite well with the golds. Now we return to Citadel Shade NULN Oil. Looking at my greys, I'm quite happy with how light they've come, but some of the shadowed areas I just wanted to re-establish. It's crazy that I'm actually just going to spend as much time on the back of this model as the front, but let's be honest, you're going to see the back of the arms and the back of the helmet, and that's pretty much it. Those goggles are almost wasted. I have thinned down this considerably because I want to establish some shadow, but I want it to be controllable. As I move around it, I'm looking for any areas of overhangs. So I'm touching around the collar area, the pockets, into the arms, into the armpits. Essentially, we're just moving around and establishing shadow where I can already see it either already is or it needs a little bit more. It's a really useful tool. I like it to balance these things out. In the end, he came out quite nice, especially considering how small he is. With the gunner, you get a real look now of how light and dark certain areas are. So I go straight in between the legs. No, that's not a funny. That's true. It's an easy place for me to test the colour, and I know that area should be shadowed due to his physical posture. That would be an obvious place to start. I give it a second or two on one leg to dry while I move around the other one. And then, happy with that, I start to move out to the overhang of his jacket. You can see there's some detail on the pockets. So I make sure I go back in again, re-establish those, do the overhangs, and just move around the model this way. Well, that's it for today, guys. Here's some final images of where we got up to. We covered both the driver and the gunner position at the front. I'm really happy with how these two came out. The Battlefront Flames of War range is really detailed for a 15mm scale. I hope you'll join me for part 2 where we'll actually tackle the vehicle.
Thanks for joining me today for this episode. If you want to see more of the team's content, why not like, subscribe, and hit that bell. As for me, I guess it's time to grab a fresh cup of tea. But more importantly, keep painting those minis, guys, and we'll see you in the next one.